think we are ready to keep on chugging away here. And if that's it, I will dive into... I feel like we dive into stuff all the time.
We are always diving into something.
We really are, man. Just head first, right?
I'll tell you, I'm transitioning into my segment.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. I have no segue, but I will ride into the sunset that is Nextcloud user management. And I say sunset because this is the last section, I believe, that we are going to touch on Nextcloud. This should wrap up all the documentation that I wanted to develop through this. I mean, it's
a lot.
It's really great.
Yeah.
It kind of lines up, with what we had going on this quarter. We did a lot, and we can dive into the next quarter with a couple more goals. Maybe reevaluate. I think we're doing good. I like this format. I mean, it's really working for us. It gives us a clear picture of what to do next, and it seems to be just fine. So I'm going to keep going with this. And that means that today we're going to touch on the last bit of Nextcloud, which is user management. Nextcloud has plenty of documentation on user management. And like any good sysadmin, I would point there before I point to my own documentation. So if I take a look at Nextcloud's documentation, the link that I sent to is more so the promo. Right, so they go through what they have and what you can do with user management and kind of their pitch, right? So their user management pitch is easy account management from 5 to 50 million users. Now, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to test that whole 50 million thesis, but hey, you know what? If it works. Now they do have a whole lot of integrations and stuff here that we will probably never use. We may in the future, but there is plenty to touch on here. To start off with, I mean, the most basic aspect of any kind of user management. I mean, what are you going to do with users? So the first one is that, anyone who's an admin, administrators, can create, modify, search, and view user accounts using Nextcloud built-in user management. Name, disk quota, mail addresses, and group membership can be handled, and users can be given administrator privileges if needed. So I wanted to dive into those last two things a little bit. I wanted to go over what Nextcloud sees as their groups and administrator privileges. So their groups here, they highlight thusly. They say you can assign new users to groups when you create them, and create new groups when you create new users. We'll unpack that in a second here. You may also use the Add Group button at the top left pane to create new groups. New group members will immediately have access to file shares that belong to their new groups. That's basically going to be the most important part of this here. To set the stage for what we start off with, there are two groups by default on rcompose installs, the admin group and the users group. By default, the initial user is placed into both of these. So what we have set up, and this is for rcompose installs that are done in compositional enterprises infrastructure. Now the script is out there in order to automate user creation and setup, but we don't include that in the role. The initial user is only set up in the only user account is set up with our third-party scripts, if you want to call them that, or our internally developed scripts. The actual role itself, that is simply going to set up the Nextcloud install and create kind of a bot administrator user. I think it's just an admin user in order to log in if you know those credentials. It's something that gets automatically vaulted, so that's always going to be secure for you. So on the compositional enterprise rcompose installs, the admin group gets set up, and that is actually a special keyword. So Nextcloud knows that the admin group is supposed to exist, and it's set to allow anyone in that group to be a server-wide admin. So in the past, however many episodes where we've been talking, when we said administrators can do this, administrators can do that. It's anyone who gets put into that group can do that. And once that happens, they are immediately able to do whatever another admin can do. And that's a server-wide admin. Then we also have a users group. This group isn't something that's necessarily recognized by Nextcloud as like a hard-coded default or a hard-coded, what do you call that? Not a magic number, but a magic string, I guess, a magic name. So this users group is none of those. It's just a group that we've determined that our users are going to go in. And additionally, any admin can create any kind of group they want. For instance, on my family's install of Nextcloud, I have a group that's called Family.
Sure.
Pretty simple.
Yeah.
Currently, there's no one else that's on that instance that's not part of the family group because we're all family there. So when something gets shared, and this is kind of the benefit of being in a group, when something gets shared with the group, everyone who's a member of that group gets that share. There's also all of these integrations that we've been talking about. We've been talking about the deck application. We've been talking about the maybe not necessarily the mail stuff, but like the calendar stuff and the contact stuff. A lot of those include shares by default, or some way to share, some way to say, grant a group access and edit permissions, for stuff like that. Those are all going to be built into Nextcloud, as well as any kind of like third-party application that you install on Nextcloud. Those will have access to those groups that you're creating by default. So those are going to be very powerful when it comes to interactivity inside of your Nextcloud instance. That's mainly what you're going to want to curate to say, let me share it with, if you're thinking organizationally, let me share this with the HR group, or let me share this with the admins group, or let me share this with the help desk group, right? You can start having these groups, and then for all these different applications, you're going to be presented with the same groups. You're not going to be surprised. You're going to know, I'm part of the HR group, so everything the HR groups gets, I get. And then onboarding new users becomes a dream, because all you got to do is add them to the HR group. They have all their shares ready to go. They have all their files, all their contacts, everything ready to go. So that's the beauty of groups. Not only that, though, groups can also have group administrators. So from their documentation, the group administrator the server administrator can delegate some work by elevating some accounts to group administrator over specified groups. This allows them to create new users as members of these groups, as well as delete or modify them. So they're able to do anything within their specific group. It's a nested hierarchy take on a permission structure, actually very similar to the thing that Matrix implemented in Spaces, which, if we haven't talked about that yet, we should as soon as it comes out of beta.
We mentioned it last week. I know that for sure.
Okay. Okay.
And we switched over to it as well, but we haven't talked about it. We should definitely bring it back up once it's out of beta, though. Because I made the comment last week that it's kind of similar to Linux in that spaces are rooms of rooms or something.
Files,
everything's a room or something. Yeah.
Everything's a room. Everything's a file.
Yeah.
Am I a file? So that was okay. So we did touch on that. Good. But it's the same kind of permission structure. I mean, you have these nested hierarchies where you can have a administrator of a specific group rather than the administrator of the entire server. You can be a little bit more picky. So you got the HR manager at this point being able to delegate stuff to HR and manage shares and permissions and users. And so that's always a good thing to see, being able to have that bit of granularity. So I think there's a lot of good things when it comes to the group membership, and when it comes to the administrator privileges. There's a really powerful administration system there in place to take advantage of. Now, it's not something you're going to be doing every day.
I was going to say, I'd call it kind of a set and forget. You set them up you're going to want to set them up for your organization no matter what size you are. And then once it is set up, it's kind of like, okay, now we have this person doing this for this role. They're an admin of this group, so they can add people to this group. That person steps down or steps away. You can just kind of replace them, and they have the role, they have the access they need. But it's definitely something you want to kind of sit down and set up as you're setting up groups within your organization, because I can say this, you don't want everyone having access to everything. You're going to want to break up who has access to finance and all the tax stuff and who has access to HR files. It's going to need to be broken up.
Yeah, that's the application of least privilege, right? You only want people to have the permissions that they need to have in order to fulfill their job, right? I mean, you don't need to give them the world. You don't have to give them the keys to the kingdom, right? Just give them enough to get to the financial statements, and that they don't need to have root on the servers.
Right.
Go figure. There was a cool instance though, as far as getting into really what administrators can do once they have those kind of architectures set up among groups. Is that I had my parents over last weekend. I was setting up some new phones for them. We were starting to sync to Nextcloud. Well, I mean, how often do you log into Nextcloud on your phone, right? Almost never. So re-logging in was a, might not remember my password kind of instance. So me, who has Bitwarden set up and doesn't have to remember his password, and is also a admin on that Nextcloud instance, was able to log in and simply reset the password of a user, right? And that's one of the cool things. And it's like they have documentation on how to do it here, but it was so incredibly simple. You click the button, the little pencil button, the edit button, right? And you said, I want to change the password, and you changed the password. I was like, oh, what's that Staples, where they hit the easy. That was easy, right? And I was like, that's all I need. I just need something easy. So thank you guys, for that. That was easy. I was happy to have that work.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Really just happy to have that work. Yeah. There were two other things mentioned in the administrator's documentation that I wanted to touch on that I thought was interesting. So the first one is setting storage quotas. So this is something that once you've gotten over the new shininess of logging into your Nextcloud server for the first time and figuring out what all to set up and going through the exploration phase where you're looking at all the new applications, installing a bazillion of them and figuring out which ones you like, you figure out that, if you start uploading 500 pictures or, 20, 25, 30, 35 videos, your storage starts to get consumed because that's how storage works. So an administrator on a server would want to make sure that you're not eating up too much storage. And that's where setting storage quotas comes into play here. So in opening their documentation, it's fairly straightforward. Just being able to select. I think you can set a default storage quota. So that's the first one. So that means every new user that comes in gets 5 gigs or something like that. You're like, all right, you can have 5 gigs. And then you can up that. You can select it for different users, set it to, 5 gigs, 5 terabytes, if you have that, if you need that much storage space, et cetera, et cetera. Now I know for Compositional Enterprise, we have the ability to add on additional disk, so we can just keep piling that on, and there's a consolidation method that it goes through, so it's fairly robust. But still, that's going to be extra expense. So if you're looking to minimize really what you need to pay to have this maintained, right, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to set some kind of storage quotas, because turns out storage isn't free. There's also another way we can do this, and we can set it up with an S3 compatible instance, which would also be something DigitalOcean makes available to us. But once again, that's still going to be something that's going to be coming out of someone's pocket. So in setting quotas, at least we can start to manage really everything that's consumed, or at very least give us a baseline to say, all right, if we're going above 5 gigs, what are we doing? And let's start to have that conversation. It's to say, hey, is there
do you need
anything we can be doing, right? Or, 20 gigs or 30 gigs or, 100 gigs or 200 gigs. What are we looking at? How are we being good stewards of what we, of what we're consuming here? There was also, and whatever that was sparked a little thought in my head. I was like, there's a whole another part of this too, and I was right. So Nextcloud does have storage quotas, a whole separate documentation on it, and they talk about how metadata takes up about 10% of disk space, but is not counted against user quotas. And remember, if we go back to our conversation about deleted files, right? Deleted files that are still in the trash bin don't count against quotas. Right. But they're still part of the user's files because they uploaded them and have since deleted them. And the trash bin itself at this point is set to 50% of the quota. So the deleted file aging is set at 30 days. And then when the deleted files exceed 50% of the quota, then the oldest files are removed first until that quota or that space gets below that 50%. Of course, you can also change that so the trash bin retention is different than that. Oh yeah, the other thing about shared files. So shared files don't actually count against your quota if you're being shared with, right? But if you share files out, those files do count against your quota.
You own the file. You would own the file at the end of the day, is how I would kind of look at it. It's yours and you're sharing it. I mean, it would make sense to count against your own quota versus, okay, this guy shared it with me. Why, I'd be kind of upset why is this dinging against me for my quota? He's the one who shared it. Now, if I had a copy of it, I would call that mine. That's going to count against my quota.
Exactly. Now, they can also unshare files with you too, so depends on how confident you are about that. Now, that is also something too that administrators need to be aware of. When you disable users, right? So sometimes you want to disable a user without permanently deleting their settings and files. So this would be something like you need to temporarily shut down an account or just kind of suspend something in order to bring it back at a later date. The user can be activated at any time again without any data loss, right? But the user will no longer be able to access their Nextcloud until you enable them again. And then keep in mind that the files which were shared by this user will no longer be accessible, right? So even though the files are still there on disk, right? The mental gymnastics being, well, the files are still there. Why can't I access them? Well, it's because the permissions are coming from the user, right? So the user would be having those, and you cannot read those permissions because the user is disabled. Right. So at this point, and I believe in the documentation there was like I can't remember if there was a workaround or if there was so you can create persistent file shares that survive that, as well as deleting users, which you can also do, and there's a whole blurb around here. And I felt that was kind of like, yeah, you can delete users, of course, right? I thought disabling users was a little bit more interesting because it's just suspending their account rather than an entire getting rid of everything.
You don't have to wipe it off and say, oh, they left for a while and now they're back. I have to recreate it. It's, oh, hey, you're back. Let me re-enable it for you.
Exactly. So that there's always going to be a workaround. I mean, when is there not going to be a workaround? But the default behavior is to cut off those file shares as soon as the user is disabled. So the functionality is there to disable the user. I found that interesting. Not something that would immediately pop to mind when I go to, all right, well, I need them to not log in right now. That's a good way to do that. I think of stuff where you have a heavily rotating cast of characters, something like the open source club, right? So you have people coming in and out of college, all the time, right? You want to respect people and say, all right, well, we're still going to have your stuff, but we also don't want you jamming up our bandwidth, and using this for your personal stuff. And we want to make it available if you contact us and say, hey, by the way, there was something that I could retrieve, that would be awesome. Right? You'd be like, yeah, no problem. I'd be happy to make that available to you, right? And the way to do that is to disable the account and re-enable it upon request, right? That enforces the you're not hogging up our bandwidth while you're not really an active member of this club or in the university, whatever, while still respecting their files and what they've done there. So that was interesting to me, the whole concept of disabling that. So I have 2 applications going here after that, but I wanted to stop there and see if you had any questions or comments, concerns, emotional outbursts.
I think I gave you the emotional outbursts. I jumped in when I needed to or when I wanted to. Sure. No questions really. I did find it actually pretty cool. I didn't realize, so I knew there was admin. I didn't know there was group admin to actually have like an administrator of a group. I didn't know that was the thing. So I'm glad you brought that up or you mentioned that, because I thought it was just, here are your admins for the server. Here are your group. Here's your, users. Here's your whatever other group is created. Now, I had no idea that you could create an admin for the group to actually kind of break that down another step. So just kind of one little thing I had to add there, but everything else has been, I've mentioned or kind of stopped you.
Cool. Sounds good. Well, like I said, there are 2 applications here that are not installed by default that I think are fairly handy. And I'm going to do these out of order because that's just the way I roll. So the first one I want to talk about is Impersonate. So by installing the Impersonate application on your Nextcloud instance, you can enable administrators to impersonate other users on the Nextcloud server. This is especially useful for debugging issues reported by users. So this is a really cool application. I really do appreciate this. This allows me as an admin to go ahead and check stuff for other users. Actually, more importantly, when I'm doing a demo, when I'm spinning up a demo instance of Nextcloud, right, and I create a user, all I got to do is log on, then I can switch to that user from my one login. And then I can just hop user to user, so I don't have to have like 3 different browser and private windows and sandbox stuff open, where I can just log in and impersonate a user, especially if I want to demonstrate like how stuff gets shared, right? Log into Nextcloud, share it from the one user, impersonate the second user, and I can demonstrate how it's right there. That makes it super handy. So in order to impersonate a user, an administrator has to simply follow the following 4 steps. Log in as administrator to Nextcloud. Open the user administration interface. Select the impersonate button on the affected user and confirm the impersonation. And then at that point, you're going to be trawling their files, their stuff, and going around all that. So the administrator at that point is then logged in as a user, and then they can switch back to their regular user account by logging out. So there are a couple notes here, right? So the first one is this app is not compatible with instances that have encryption enabled. So we talked about that, and the encryption, and the reason this is that the encryption uses the password for the user to generate the key that unlocks their files. So if their encryption is enabled, I can't impersonate and see the files because I can't put in that password when I impersonate. I'm simply switching the permission structure of mine from mine to the users, right? So that permission is not going to include the password, which therefore cannot generate the decryption key. Therefore, I cannot see any of the encrypted files. Next, while impersonate actions are logged, note that the actions performed impersonated will be logged as the impersonated user. So the audit trail will show the step to impersonate a user, right? But then everything after that, it's not going to say Andrew as demo user. It'll just say that the demo user did this, right? So it makes following the audit trail a little bit more difficult, but at least those impersonate actions should be
showing
called
up
out.
right
Yeah, and it should be able to, you should be able to track that. It just doesn't make it explicit. And then the last thing here, and why I touched on this before, is that impersonating a user is only possible after their first login. So I did want to expressly call that out to say, hey,
you can't create a guest user and then immediately impersonate that guest user. You have to log in with that guest user, is what you're saying?
Yes. So the password has to be, yeah, you have to log in the first time because you have to go through the whole initial login screen. I'm not even aware what scripts run on first run, but I know almost everything. Whenever I set up anything anywhere, there's always a first run script because stuff needs to be instantiated.
Sure.
And I can't imagine that Nextcloud is any different. So when they do that, they want the actual user logged in first to walk them through all that stuff. And maybe it's something first time to set up the password or whatever. I'm not sure. So I would want to dig a little bit more deeper into that. But at this point, I'm content with just saying, all right, yeah, sure. You got to log in with the user first. I can open a private window and do that easy. Yeah, so that app has been really helpful for me, especially trying to get to know how stuff looks from other people's points of view, right? As when I go to share a file, like one of the things I found out, when I go to share a file, it doesn't matter where it's in my hierarchy, right? It gets put in their root directory structure, right? And then, if I were to be the second user, what happens if I move it, right? And how can I test the edit permissions, right? And figure out what permissions I need. This is really, really good in order to kind of get a feel for how the interactivity between users is going to work, right? Without really spending a whole lot of time and energy kind of flipping back and forth between windows and stuff. It's just a really quick way to navigate around and troubleshoot issues and test out new functionality. So that is definitely one that I've used before. I don't have that, I don't think, currently on any of the instances that I manage. Maybe my family one, but it's a good one to have, especially if you're getting ready to implement a new Nextcloud instance. And really, if you're new to the software and you're going to go present it to a team or something like that, if you're doing any kind of demonstration or any kind of walkthrough, this is also going to be very, very helpful because you can start impersonating users and saying, hey, all right, let's take a look at your directory structure. Since we use ServiceNow at work, that's been a really good way to do that as well. I mean, the administrators there are top-notch that we have. And they use that all the time in order to kind of demonstrate how to walk through stuff. And when I say, hey, I can't access something, they'll be like, oh, really? Let me impersonate you and try it out. And they're like, yeah, sure enough, you don't have access to it. I'm like, that's what I said. Similarly, the other application I have here is the guests application. This one's pretty cool. This one I haven't necessarily been able to play around with, but this pitches it like so. It says this application allows for better collaboration with external users by allowing users to create guest accounts. So guest accounts can be created from the share menu by entering either the recipient's email or name and choosing create guest account. Once the share is created, the guest user will receive an email notification about the mail with a link sent to their password. It's pretty cool. Guest users can only access files shared to them and can't create any files outside of shares. Additionally, the apps accessible to guest accounts are whitelisted. Right? So you would, one, have to explicitly say you are able to access both the files and the calendar account, or you can just say, nah, all you get is the files, right? And not only that, all you get are the shares within the share that I shared with you,
right,
in the files. So this is like a hyper sandboxed account, where really they are only getting the bare minimum, and it's really only meant for collaboration purposes with external users. Now, this may require an SMTP setup, which is something that we may be implementing Q3 or Q4. I don't know if it's going to be Q3, but it's certainly something I want to tackle this year. So adding SMTP would be integral to this because this then allows them to set their password. Yeah, exactly. And it may be something that can work without that. I'm not sure, but because I mean, you can send email from anywhere that has port 25 open, right? It's not going to come through an SMTP server that has, reverse DNS and DKIM and DeepMark set up. So Gmail's probably going to label it as spam. So you might want to not do that and instead figure out a better way to have them set their password. But at some point, right, and if email is set up, right, because I can set this up from within Nextcloud. I can say, hey, by the way, you know what? I'm just going to set this up with my personal email.
Right.
And then I can just use that, right? What we're talking about is like a compositional enterprise specific, right? Our infrastructure will be able to handle that. Yeah. And that'll automatically propagate through the instances, yada, yada, yada. Even if we don't have that set up, that doesn't mean that that's not something that you can do right now today, right? You can go ahead and say, hey, I want to relay this through Yahoo or through Fastmail or Proton Mail. Yeah. And anything like that. So there is certainly ways to get this up and running immediately, is what I'm trying to say. But I thought that was a really cool app. And I think that really helps with external communication, even in instances like, hey, I want, and I have yet to test this, but like sharing calendars, right? I think that would be awesome because I don't want everyone to see all my calendars, but I still, want them to have an account to be able to create events for me, right? Especially if we have a shared calendar and it's like, hey, by the way, can you add this to our calendar? And, they're like, yeah, absolutely. And they add it to the calendar. They don't, have any other calendars or any other whatever, but they can absolutely access that one. Same thing with files. If you're doing anything collaboratively, if you're doing any video editing or just document sharing, what have you, right? And you want more than a public share. You want them to be able to upload, download, but and because you can already upload, download, and you can also password protect stuff. So at this point, that would just be another level of getting them into the ecosystem. And honestly, it's not a bad way to onboard someone and say, you know what, look, don't worry about 90% of what Nextcloud is, right? All I want you to do is right here, calendar thing right here. People understand what a calendar is, or files. People understand what a file is. Easier to work your way into that ecosystem and say, oh yeah, by the way, what you're working with is Nextcloud. You don't have to worry about it. It does its job. And really, at the end of the day, that's all you need. I mean, you just need something that does your job for you. And yeah, we expose all the administrative stuff. We're not a shared hosting provider for that exact reason, right? We want to make sure that you can have the ability to act as a power user, right? You can have the ability to mess up sometimes, right? But giving you that safety net, right? In order to catch you if you do end up falling. But with that level of access, you can really start tweaking and really start making stuff work for you, right? So if you're looking at, if you're using some of these managed services, right? And I know Google Docs, right? And Google Photos and all that, they're starting to clamp stuff down, right? They're not letting you do stuff. If you're sick and tired of that, right? And what you're hearing is vibing with you, definitely at least sign up for the mailing list at rcompose.com, right? That's where you're going to be getting all the news and updates. That's where you're going to be getting the stuff we're putting out, the how-tos, right? These episode reminders, stuff like that. We will keep producing this stuff as long as we can for you, right? This is what we love to do, and to be fair, we're pretty good at it.
Absolutely, I would say.
And I think it's the only ethical thing to do. So we're gonna keep providing the service and keep preaching this message as long as we can.